Have you ever wondered whether the entire history of the 19th century that we were taught in school is just a poorly directed play? For years they drilled into our heads the dates of great battles, the names of commanders, and the schemes of troop movements. But no one ever asked us to simply open our eyes and look at the details. You were deceived. We were all deceived. And the scale of this lie is so grandiose that the brain initially refuses to accept it. But let's set aside the school textbooks written by the victors for a second and turn on elementary logic. What if I tell you that the so-called Patriotic War of 1812 was not at all a war between two warring states? What if it was a joint punitive operation, carefully planned and coordinated by a single command center? Sounds like the ravings of a madman. Don't rush to conclusions. Just look at the facts that lie on the surface, but which historians diligently ignore. Let's start with the most obvious, with what catches the eye of anyone who has ever examined battle paintings or reconstructions of those times. Look at the uniforms. I ask you to peer closely at the soldiers of the so-called French army and the army of the Russian Empire. What do you see? If we remove the color differentiation, where some are painted blue and others dark green, we see absolute, frightening identity. The same shakos, those tall, uncomfortable hats that widen upward, the same white cross belts, the same epaulets, cut of the coats, the same white trousers, which, by the way, are the height of idiocy for field conditions. Have you ever tried walking in white pants through autumn slush? And now imagine a march over thousands of miles. Who in their right mind would approve such a uniform for a real war of survival? This is a uniform not for trenches and mud, but for parades or police functions in cities. But let's go further. Official history tells us that at the beginning of the 19th century, industry was weakly developed. Everything was sewn by hand. Can you imagine the logistics of sewing hundreds of thousands, millions of uniform sets that are identical in cut for two supposedly warring sides? This is not just a fashion coincidence. Fashion is when ladies in Paris and St. Petersburg wear similar hats. But when two armies that are supposed to kill each other are dressed like twin brothers, that's called unification of standards. Standardization is possible only in one system. Imagine that today, the army of one superpower and the army of another superpower went out to the battlefield in absolutely identical helmets, body armor, and with the same weapons. And the only difference was in the shade of camouflage. In real combat conditions, in smoke and chaos, this would be suicide. And now, recall what a battle was like at the beginning of the 19th century. It was black, smoky gunpowder. After the first salvo of artillery and rifles, the battlefield is shrouded in thick, acrid fog. Visibility drops to a few yards. In this hell, in this gray haze, how is a soldier supposed to distinguish his own from the enemy? By the color of the collar? By the shade of the cloth, which after 3 days of marching becomes covered in a layer of dust and dirt and turns the same gray-brown? In such a war as historians depict for us, the level of friendly fire would have been colossal. The soldiers would have shot each other down in the first 15 minutes of battle. Unless it was one army. Or unless it was a fixed match, where the goals were entirely different. The uniform oddities are just the tip of the iceberg. Let's talk about the officer corps. We are told that the Russian nobility was so enlightened that it spoke French better than its native language. Ponder this absurdity. Officers of the Russian army, commanders issuing orders to soldiers, speak the enemy's language. In headquarters, in salons, in personal correspondence, everywhere French. We are told this was due to fashion, but imagine the situation. 1941, and Soviet officers communicate exclusively in German, write letters to their wives in it, and read German literature, considering the Russian language the tongue of the rabble. This is impossible. This is nonsense. Language is an us versus them system. If the elites of two countries speak the same language, share one culture, the same values, and are even often related by blood, then they have far more in common with each other than with their own peasant soldiers. This leads to a terrifying thought. The War of 1812 looks not like a clash of nations, but like the suppression of an uprising or a territory cleanup by the combined forces of the elites. Officers on both sides understood each other perfectly. They could calmly negotiate, meet on neutral ground, and exchange pleasantries. For them it was a game, a chess match, where the pieces were ordinary people conscripted through recruit levies. Have you noticed that in this war there was virtually no guerrilla warfare in the sense that we are presented with it? Yes, they tell us about peasants with pitchforks, but real documents show strange things. Peasants often did not understand who was in front of them, a Frenchman or a Russian master. For a Russian peasant, both were strangers, speaking an incomprehensible master's language, dressed in identical tight coats, and plundering their villages. And here we come to the main question. Who was this war really waged against? If the uniforms are identical, if the command speaks the same language, if the battle tactics are mirror images, then perhaps the enemy was neither in the west nor in the east. Perhaps this gigantic armada, which marched back and forth along the old Smolensk road, was actually clearing out the remnants of something we are forbidden to know? Look at the maps of that time. Look at the strange absence of large cities on vast territories that are now densely populated. Or, conversely, at the ruins that ruinist artists painted from life exactly at that time. They weren't painting fantasies. They were documenting the aftermath. We are used to thinking that Napoleon was an invader who came to enslave Russia. But why then didn't he go to the capital? Why did he go to Moscow, which by that time was no longer the official capital? Historians mumble something vague about the heart of Russia. But from a military standpoint, this is nonsense. To defeat a country, you need to capture the government, the treasury, the ports. Petersburg was the logical target. But Napoleon, this tactical genius, supposedly makes a detour and heads deep into the continent, stretching his supply lines and dooming his army to starvation. This is suicide for a strategist of his caliber. Unless his goal was precisely that route. Unless his task was to march exactly along that line, destroying everything in his path together with the Russian army, which, note, was also retreating along the same route, burning everything behind it. The scorched earth tactic. Who applied it? The Russian army? The French army? They acted like a single mechanism for destroying the region's infrastructure. Two huge death machines followed one after the other, grinding up cities, villages, food supplies, bridges, and crossings. As a result of this war, a vast swath of land turned into a desert. Archives, chronicles, old buildings were destroyed. And then, when the smoke cleared, historians wrote a beautiful fairy tale about a great confrontation, heroism, and tactical maneuvers. But if you look at the supply figures, the number of horses needed to transport provisions, the road capacity of that time, you will understand. The official version is physically impossible. These armies could not exist in the form described to us. Either there were 10 times fewer of them, or they used resources we are not told about. Or it was not a war at all, but something else. Something that required the presence of hundreds of thousands of armed people in identical uniforms, ready to follow orders without question. Let's now set aside emotions and take up the most terrible tool for official history. No, it's not an archaeologist's shovel. It's a calculator. Mathematics is a science that cannot be negotiated with, cannot be bribed, and cannot be rewritten to suit the ruling dynasty. And if we apply dry mathematics to the official version of the War of 1812, the entire majestic picture will crumble to dust, leaving only bewilderment and the understanding that we are being treated like idiots. We are told about Napoleon's Grande Armée, numbering around 600,000 men, that invaded Russia. 600,000. Ponder this figure. It's the population of a large regional center. And this entire mass of people, horses, wagons, moves along a single road. Let's calculate the logistics. The main problem of a 19th century army was not gunpowder and bullets, but food. And first of all, food not for people, but for horses. Cavalry, artillery, wagons, staff carriages. By the most conservative estimates, such an army required no fewer than 150,000 horses. A draft horse is not a cat. It can't catch mice. It needs a minimum of 22 pounds of oats and hay per day. Otherwise, after a week, it simply won't get up. And after 2, it will die. Multiply 150,000 head by 22 pounds. We get 3.3 million pounds of fodder per day. 3.3 million pounds that need to be obtained, loaded, delivered, and distributed somewhere. Official history tells us about wagon trains. Fine. A standard wagon of that time carries about 1,100 pounds of cargo. To supply the army with fodder for just one day, you need 3,000 wagons. But these wagons are also pulled by horses that need to be fed too. This is a vicious circle, known in logistics as the supply tail. At a distance of more than 200 miles, horse-drawn transport starts carrying food only for itself. And Napoleon covered thousands of miles. They tell us about requisitions and plundering of the local population. But come on, what was the population density at that time? Peasant farms lived by natural barter. They had no industrial stocks of oats. To feed such a horde by plunder, the army would have to fan out over hundreds of miles, not march in a dense column along the Smolensk road. If they had marched as depicted on the maps, the rear ranks would have been walking through a scorched desert, where every blade of grass was eaten and every puddle drunk dry. The conclusion is simple. Either the army sizes are exaggerated dozens of times, and it was local skirmishes of small professional detachments, or they had completely different supply technologies that we don't know about. Or, and this is the scariest, they used pre-created depots. And who could create giant food depots along the route of the enemy army? Only the receiving side. This confirms the version that the French army's passage was coordinated, provided for, and paid for. It was not a war, but a transit, or a joint operation to clear the territory of a third party. Now let's look at the roads. Have you seen Russian country roads in autumn? It's mud in which tractors sink. They tell us that hundreds of thousands of feet, hooves, and wheels passed along these roads. Hundreds of heavy artillery pieces. According to the laws of physics, after the passage of the first 10,000 men and hundreds of wagons, any dirt road turns into an impassable quagmire 3 feet deep. Movement should have stopped. The army should have halted. But they marched at incredible speed, covering huge distances in a matter of days. This is possible only in 2 cases. Either the roads were hard, paved like Roman roads, remnants of which we sometimes find and cannot explain, or they moved not on roads. Look at the star forts. These mysterious star-shaped structures are scattered across all of Europe and the European part of Russia. Official history attributes their construction to Peter I, or to some local princes. But look at the volume of earthworks. To build one such earth fortress, millions of cubic yards of soil need to be moved. Without excavators, with shovels. and to do it with perfect geometric precision, visible only from the air. Why? Against whom? They tell us it's for defense from bastions, to create crossfire. But many of these forts are located so that they protect nothing. They stand in open fields or around cities, but their ramparts are directed strangely. The War of 1812 amazingly followed exactly along the line of these forts. Borodino, Smolensk, Moscow. Everywhere we see traces of these gigantic structures. What if the war was aimed at destroying or capturing precisely this ancient infrastructure? What if French and Russians are just names of two corps of one global army that came to occupy these objects, drive out those who were there, and establish its order? Recall the Moscow fire. We are told Muscovites burned their own city so it wouldn't fall to the enemy. Ponder the psychology of this act. People built houses, churches, accumulated property for centuries, and then just burned it all? This contradicts human nature. People hide their goods, not destroy them. But if a city needs to be cleared, if traces of what was there before the liberators arrived need to be hidden, then a total fire is the best solution. And Moscow burned strangely. Stones melted. Brick turned into glass. An ordinary wood fire doesn't reach such temperatures. Wood burns at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, but to melt brickwork requires over 2,200 degrees. Witnesses described a strange glow, roar, fire whirlwinds that arose from nowhere. This looks more like the use of some high-powered weapon unknown to us than arson by drunken quartermasters with hay. And one more detail that makes you uneasy: demography. If you open the statistical yearbooks of the 19th century and look at the population growth curves, you will see strange dips, but not where the war should have been. We see the absence of millions of people who should have been born but weren't, or who disappeared. Vast territories of Russia after 1812 stand empty. Where did the population go? They tell us about combat losses, epidemics, famine, but the numbers don't add up. Army losses are hundreds of thousands, but the population shortfall is millions. It feels like the territory was combed through with a fine-tooth comb, taking away everyone capable of holding a shovel or bearing children. This entire war looks like a gigantic operation to replace the population, or relocate it. Recall Arakchev's military settlements, which appeared immediately after the war. These were essentially concentration camps, where soldiers were forced to farm and peasants to march. People were standardized, their memories erased, accustomed to new orders, a new faith, a new history. The uniform we talked about earlier was a symbol of this new order, identical for everyone, because now there were no us and them by blood or lineage. There were only subjects of the system. But the most interesting is yet to come. If we assume that the war was a staged cleanup, then what were they hiding? What technologies were destroyed? Why did the world change so sharply after this war, and we suddenly forgot how to build, how to heal, how to live in harmony with space? Why is the architecture of the early 19th century, masterpieces with columns and domes that we cannot replicate, while by the end of the century we degenerated into primitive boxes? Where did the break occur? Look around. If you live in an old city, or have at least once walked through the historical center of any large settlement built before the mid-19th century, you have seen this hundreds of times. But your brain, hypnotized by the school curriculum, refused to ask the right questions. Look at the first floors of buildings. Why did they go half underground, or even up to the tops of the windows? They tell us it's the cultural layer. Remember this phrase, cultural layer. This is the most brazen and stupid lie that historians invented to hide a planetary-scale catastrophe. They try to drill into us that our ancestors were such sloppy pigs that for centuries they didn't clean up their dirt and dust, allowing the ground level to rise by 10, 13, or even 16 feet. Can you imagine trampling a knee-deep layer of dirt in your apartment over your lifetime? And we're talking about paved streets of imperial capitals where street cleaners worked around the clock. But even if we allow this nonsense about dust accumulation, explain to me from an engineering logic standpoint, why would an architect, designing a luxurious mansion, make full windows, doors, and arches that immediately end up underground? Why build the first floor just to bury it later and use it as a basement? This is absurd. Windows are for light. Doors are for entry. If they are underground, it means when they were built, the ground was lower. This means only one thing. These buildings were buried. And they were buried not over centuries, but all at once, as a result of a colossal emission of soil, clay, and sand. And this happened not long before the warring armies in identical uniforms marched through these lands. Here lies the key to the true purpose of the War of 1812. It was not a war of conquest. It was a war of looters and liquidators. Imagine that a global catastrophe occurred. Call it whatever you want: flood, mudflow, tectonic shift. Huge, flourishing cities built by a previous, far more advanced civilization were half destroyed and buried in clay. The population partially perished, partially degraded, losing technologies and connections. And so the new masters arrive on the ruins of this old world. The very ones who sewed themselves beautiful uniforms, invented new flags, and began dividing the inheritance. The armies of Napoleon and Alexander I did not march to fight. They marched to inventory and clear out the surviving but empty cities. That's exactly why they moved along strange routes. They went from one surviving industrial center to another. Moscow was not just a city. It was a gigantic logistical hub of the old civilization. And when the French entered it, they found not wooden huts, but majestic antique structures that we see in the paintings of ruinist artists. Did you think these artists were painting fantasies? Piranesi, Robert, Alexeyev. They were documentarians. They painted what they saw: gigantic arches, ruined aqueducts, incredible domes overgrown with trees right on the roofs. These were the ruins of high antiquity that stood here, in Russia, long before the Romanovs arrived. The Moscow fire was necessary to hide the traces of this architecture. It was necessary to destroy the remnants of what the new authorities could not explain or use. Two complex mechanisms, buildings with two incomprehensible purposes. It was easier to blow them up and say that's how it was, or blame it all on the evil Corsican. Have you noticed how abruptly architecture simplified after 1812? Before that, masterpieces impossible to replicate without CNC machines, perfect stone polishing, polygonal masonry, the most complex geometry. And after, crooked bricks and plaster. We degenerated. We lost stone processing technologies. We forgot how to build without cement. We unlearned how to make star forts. By the way, about the forts. Star forts are another bomb that blows up the official version. There are thousands of them around the world. They have a perfect geometric shape, impossible to lay out on the ground without high-class geodetic instruments and aviation. And most importantly, they make no military sense for defense against the cannons of that time. The walls are too low, the angles strange. But if you look at them as technical devices, for example, as gas stations or wave energy generators, everything falls into place. the water surrounding them, the complex system of canals. This is part of the technological process. 19th century armies used these forts as bases, but they didn't build them. They simply occupied them. And many battles of that war took place precisely for control over these objects. The Borodino field is not just a field. If you look at old maps, structures of gigantic earth ramparts are traceable there too, which were part of the ancient system. And here's one more fact that makes your blood run cold. Climate. Have you read the memoirs of participants in that war? They write about fierce frosts that destroyed the French army. But look at the paintings of that time, at the clothing of peasants and soldiers. Light coats, absence of serious winter gear. In Europe, houses have huge windows, high ceilings, and no stoves. The fireplaces we see in palaces are decoration. They physically cannot heat halls 20 feet high. The heat goes up the chimney. This means the climate was different. Before the catastrophe and the war, it was warm here. Pineapples grew in St. Petersburg greenhouses, not under lamps, but almost in natural conditions. The sharp cooling, the year without a summer, officially recorded in 1816, is a direct consequence of what happened during the war. Perhaps a weapon was used that changed the atmosphere. Nuclear winter? Volcanic winter? Or artificial climate change to finish off the survivors and force them into new economic constraints. After all, in the cold, man becomes a slave. He needs firewood, coal, warm clothing, a sturdy house. They are easier to control. He cannot simply live in nature. He depends on the system. The War of 1812 became a watershed. It separated the golden age of antiquity that existed on the territory of Russia and Europe from the gray, cold, and dirty era in which we live now. We live on ruins, in houses that were excavated, patched up, and passed off as our own. We walk on streets under which the real first floors lie, full of secrets. And the officers in identical uniforms knew exactly what they were doing. They were clearing space for a new world elite. They were destroying the memory that people were once free, lived in warmth, and possessed technologies that seem like magic to us today. But the scariest thing is not even this. The scariest thing is the substitution of concepts about who we are. If the cities were not built by us, if the forts stood before us, then where did we come from? Where did those millions of peasants come from, who could neither read nor write, and who suddenly filled the empty territories after the war? Was it mass resettlement? Or cloning? It sounds wild, but look at the demographic explosions of the second half of the 19th century. The population doubles and triples at an incredible rate, which is biologically impossible given the medicine and hygiene of that time. And now let's ask ourselves the most uncomfortable and personal question, the answer to which may shatter your idea of your own family. Who are you? No, not your name and profession. Who are your ancestors? I'll bet anything that most of you cannot name your great-great-grandfather. You know your parents, grandmothers, grandfathers. Maybe you've heard stories about your great-grandmother. But beyond that, a black hole, emptiness, darkness. Why does our civilization, which supposedly developed continuously for thousands of years, have no family memory deeper than the mid-19th century? They tell us peasants were illiterate, archives burned, wars destroyed documents. How convenient. All the archives burn exactly at the moment when ends need to be hidden in water. But there are things that cannot be burned. This is genetic memory, and basic statistics that scream to us that in the mid-19th century, a global reboot of humanity occurred. Look at the demographic charts. These are not just growth curves. This is proof of a biological miracle impossible under natural conditions. In the first half of the 19th century, right after that strange war with identical uniforms, the Earth's population, and especially Russia's, begins to grow exponentially. They tell us about high birth rates, but come on. Without antibiotics, with horrendous infant mortality, with constant epidemics of cholera and smallpox, the population cannot double every 30 to 40 years. This is a law of biology. For the population to skyrocket like that, you need either to completely eliminate death or bring in new people from outside. The explosive population growth of the 19th century is either mass migration from other territories unknown to us or artificial settlement of cleared lands. Recall the term, Ivan who remembers no kin. This is not just a saying. It was the legal status of a huge number of people in 19th century Russia. Vagrants, convicts, fugitives? Or were these the very new people who appeared out of nowhere, having no past, no lineage, no tribe? They flooded the cities and villages, occupied the empty houses, but didn't know how to use them. This is where the answer lies to the question about the strange dissonance between architecture and everyday life. We see on old photographs majestic buildings with stucco, huge doors, and ceilings nearly 16 feet high. And living in them are people in bast shoes who heat pot-belly stoves right in the middle of palace halls. They look like squatters who moved into an abandoned elite residential complex. They didn't build these houses. They don't even understand their purpose. For them, these stone giants are just caves in which to shelter from the cold. Let's return to our officers in identical uniforms. If we accept the reboot version, their role becomes sinisterly clear. These were not armies of warring states. These were convoy troops, overseers. Their task was not to fight each other, but to bring order to the chaos, distribute the new people across territories, suppress pockets of resistance from those who survived the catastrophe, and guard the surviving technological objects. The French language of the nobility is the language of administration, the language of colonizers, which distinguished managers from worker personnel. That's why the officers got along perfectly with each other, and soldiers were expendable material for them. Serfdom, which, by the way, amazingly disappeared around the world almost simultaneously in the mid-century, was not just a form of exploitation. It was a strict regime for the newly arrived population. Attachment to the land, prohibition on movement, total control. As soon as the new ones adapted, learned to speak, work, and pray to new gods, the regime was relaxed. And here's another fact that historians diligently avoid: the huge number of foundling homes that appeared in Russia and Europe exactly during this period. These were gigantic complexes through which hundreds of thousands of children passed. Where did these children come from in such quantities? They tell us illegitimate children, foundlings. But the scales are incomparable to ordinary social statistics. These were conveyor belts for growing loyal population. Children were raised in barracks conditions, given new surnames, often names of birds, animals, or church holidays, and released into life with a clean memory. They didn't know their parents not because they were abandoned, but because they might not have had parents in the usual sense. This generation of orphans became the foundation of the people we consider our ancestors. Look at the first photographs from the mid-19th century. Daguerreotypes. Streets of Paris, St. Petersburg, Moscow. They are empty. Absolutely empty. We are told it's due to long exposures. People were moving and blurring. But that's a lie. With a 10 to 15-minute exposure on a busy street, there would still be shadows, blurred silhouettes of crowds, carriages. But we see dead cities. Perfect geometry, clean pavements, and not a soul, as if people were erased with an eraser. Or they simply weren't there yet. The cities stand ready, repaired after the catastrophe, but not yet populated. The population will be brought in later. Those very peasants in bast shoes and workers in caps will appear in photos only by the end of the century, when the reboot process enters its final stage. The technological leap at the end of the 19th century is also a myth. We are told that we invented electricity, radio, automobiles. But if you look closely, we simply began finding and adapting what was left from the previous civilization. Atmospheric electricity, collected by temple domes and tower spires, was replaced with primitive wired electricity because we couldn't restore wireless technologies. Gas lighting, pneumatic mail, trams on strange traction. All these were attempts to use the remnants of former luxury. We live in a cargo cult world. We pray to icons without understanding that they might be schematics or instructions. We wear crosses without knowing that they might be elements of technical circuits. We use words whose meaning has long been lost. The War of 1812 was a cover operation, a grand spectacle with pyrotechnics and extras whose goal was to write off city destructions as combat actions and legitimize the presence of huge army contingents engaged in cleanup. Napoleon and Alexander were partners, executive directors of one global project to reformat the world. Perhaps they weren't even enemies. Recall the Treaty of Tilsit. Recall how they hugged and kissed each other. This is not the behavior of enemies, but of colleagues who successfully completed a corporate merger. And the millions of soldiers who died on the fields, this was just collateral damage, writing off outdated biological assets. But the scariest thing about this reboot is that it might not be the last. If they did it once, just 200 years ago, erasing the memory of all humanity, rewriting books and inventing a false history, then what prevents them from doing it again? We see the same signs today. Unification, strange epidemics, attempts to reduce the population, rewriting history right before our eyes. The scenario is repeating. Now that we have pieced together the fragments of this grand mosaic, the main question arises before us, one that affects not only our understanding of the past, but our future as well. Who is the director of this show? Who is that invisible puppeteer who dressed two supposedly warring armies in identical uniforms, supplied them with the same weapons, gave them maps of non-existent routes, and sent them to clear the territory of traces of the great, ancient civilization? We are approaching the most dangerous line of our investigation. Official history feeds us tales of emperors' political ambitions, struggles for markets, and continental blockades. But this is a screen. This is a smokescreen to divert our eyes. The true customers of the War of 1812 and the subsequent global reboot never wore crowns. They wore modest frock coats and sat in the quiet of banking offices in London, Geneva, and the Vatican. Recall who really profited from the Napoleonic Wars. Not France, which was bled dry. Not Russia, which lay in ruins with its ancient capital burned. Transnational financial clans won. It was precisely after this strange war, resembling a fixed match, that a unified financial system was established in the world. The gold standard, usury interest, central banks, all these instruments of humanity's enslavement were introduced immediately after the smoke of battles cleared. Officers in identical uniforms fulfilled their task. They destroyed the old world, a world without usury interest, a world of free energy and high technologies, and prepared a beachhead for building the capitalist concentration camp in which we still live. We must realize the terrible truth. States, as we know them, are fiction. They are simply administrative districts of one global corporation created in the 19th century. Borders, flags, anthems. This is marketing designed to divide us, make us hate our neighbors, and not ask questions about why the buttons on the uniforms of enemy army soldiers were cast in the same factory. The War of 1812 was a punitive operation against the remnants of Great Tartary, or whatever that unified world ancient civilization was called. They destroyed it, shattered it into pieces, rewrote the languages, invented new nationalities, and pitted them against each other so they could never unite again and remember their true greatness. Look at the Industrial Revolution, which historians are so proud of. They tell us that in the mid-19th century, we suddenly got smarter and began inventing locomotives and machines. But if you look closely, it looks not like invention, but like unmothballing. We simply began excavating and starting up what was left from the previous owners. The red brick factories that we see all over the world were not built as factories. They were power plants, generating stations, storage facilities. We simply attached pipes to them, started burning coal, and called it progress. We are like savages who found a smartphone and use it as a cutting board, proud of how flat and convenient it is. Our civilization is a civilization of scavengers, living on the ruins of the gods.